The dust had barely settled behind Andrew Garrison's horse before the whole town of Caldwell, Kansas seemed to hold its breath, sensing without knowing that the tall, broad-shouldered man who had just ridden in off the southern trail carried something heavier than the saddlebags draped across his roan gelding's flanks. It was the autumn of 1878, a year when the cattle drives were thinning out, and the railroad had already begun to pull the wild from the west, though you would not have known it looking at Caldwell that afternoon. The main street was packed dirt and stubborn weeds, lined with a general store, a livery, a barbershop with a lopsided striped pole, a saloon that smelled of sawdust and whiskey even from 20 yards away, and a modest row of homesteads fanning out beyond the town's edge like fingers spread open across the prairie. The sky was that particular shade of deep October blue that made the whole world look painted, wide and cold and endless above the flat Kansas land. Andrew pulled his horse to a stop outside the livery and sat there a moment longer than necessary. He was 31 years old, lean and weathered in the way that men who spent their lives outdoors became weathered, not old, but seasoned, like wood left out through enough summers and winters to grow dense and quiet. His hat was dark brown and well worn at the brim. His coat was heavy canvas, the kind that kept wind out better than it kept warmth in. His jaw was set in a way that other men recognized without being able to name it. It was the jaw of someone carrying a thing they did not want to carry. He had ridden 2 days straight from the Triple Fork Ranch, 50 miles southeast of here, where he worked as a cattle foreman for a rancher named Holt Briggs. The ride had given him too much time to think, and not nearly enough time to figure out what he was going to say when he got here. He had rehearsed the words 100 times in his head, trying them out against the open sky, watching them dissolve before they ever became real. He had tried plain and direct. He had tried gentle and slow. He had tried every combination between them, and none of it felt like anything except wrong, because there was no right way to say what he had come to say. He climbed down from the horse, handed the reins to the young livery boy who appeared at the sound of hooves, and stood in the middle of the street looking at the homestead at the far north end of town. The one with the kitchen garden running along its eastern wall, still showing the dried stalks of late summer vegetables that had not yet been pulled. The one with the yellow curtains in the front window that he could see even from here. He had been told about those curtains, described them in a letter, knew them as a detail the way you know details about a place you have never been but have been told about by someone who loved it. He put one foot in front of the other and walked toward the house. Her name was Mary Rhodes, and she was 27 years old, and she had been living in Caldwell for 3 years, having come out from Missouri with her husband Thomas after they married young and full of hope, and convinced that the Kansas prairie was a place where a man could build something worth passing down. Thomas Rhodes had been a carpenter by trade and a dreamer by nature, the kind of man who could look at a flat piece of land and see a house, look at a house and see a home, look at a home and see a dynasty of children and grandchildren stretching forward into a future that was bright and wide and thoroughly earned. He had built their house himself, every plank and post and beam, and Mary had made it into a home the way only she knew how, with those yellow curtains and a kitchen garden and a cast iron stove that she kept polished until it gleamed in coffee that people in town said was the best in the county. She was in that kitchen now, standing at the stove with her back to the front door, stirring a pot of something that smelled of onions and dried beef, when she heard the knock. It was not the knock of a neighbor or a friend. It was the knock of someone who was not sure they wanted to be heard. She set down her wooden spoon and wiped her hands on her apron and went to the door. Andrew Garrison stood on her porch with his hat in his hands, turning it slowly by the brim the way men did when they had run out of things to do with their hands. He was taller than she had expected, though she had not been expecting anyone at all. His eyes were gray-green, the color of sage in winter, and they were looking at her with an expression that made something cold move through her chest before he had said a single word. "Mrs. Rhodes," he said. His voice was low and careful, and it had the quality of a voice that was being held very deliberately steady. "I am," she said. "Can I help you?" He opened his mouth. He closed it again. He looked past her for a half-second at the yellow curtains, at the kitchen beyond, at the ordinary and private life of the house behind her, and something in his face shifted in a way that she would remember for a long time afterward. Like a man stepping to the edge of a cliff and looking down and finding that the bottom was farther than he had reckoned. "My name is Andrew Garrison," he said. "I ride for Holt Briggs, out at Triple Fork. I knew your husband, Mrs. Rhodes. I rode with him." The cold thing moved through her chest again, slower this time. "Thomas is not back yet," she said. "He went down to Triple Fork 6 weeks ago to take on some work." She paused. "I have been expecting him back by the end of the month." Andrew did not say anything for a moment that lasted too long. His hands kept turning the hat. "Ma'am," he began and stopped. He pressed his lips together. He looked at the porch boards beneath his boots. He looked back up at her, and his eyes were honest and pained, and entirely without the words he needed. There was an he. Mary looked at him. She looked at his face, and the way he was holding himself, and the way his voice had stopped working. And she understood then, in the way that people sometimes understand things before they have been told them, the way the body knows before the mind catches up. She understood it the way she had been afraid to understand it for the last 3 weeks when the letters stopped coming and the days started stacking up wrong. Her hand moved to the door frame, not to close it, just to hold on to something. "Come inside," she said. Her voice was very quiet. "Come inside and sit down. I will make coffee." He looked at her. He did not move immediately. He seemed to be trying to figure out if he deserved to be invited in, if he had any right to the warmth of her kitchen when he was carrying what he was carrying. "Please," she said. He came inside. She pointed him to the chair at the kitchen table, the one nearest the window, and she busied herself with the coffee because she needed something to do with her hands the same way he needed something to do with his. She put the pot on the stove and measured the grounds with the small tin scoop her mother had given her, and she kept her back to him for as long as it took to do those things, because she needed a moment where she was not looking at him and his expression, and the hat he had now set on the table because he did not know what else to do with it. The kitchen was warm and quiet. Outside, the October wind pushed against the windows in a low, constant murmur. A clock on the wall ticked. The coffee pot began to heat. She turned around and sat across from him and folded her hands on the table in front of her and waited. Andrew looked at her. He looked at her folded hands and the way she was sitting very straight and very still, the way people sat when they were bracing for something. He thought about the words he had practiced for 2 days on the open trail, all the ways he had tried to arrange what had happened into something that could be said out loud without destroying the silence of this kitchen. They were all gone now. Every version of every sentence he had rehearsed had dissolved the moment she opened the door and looked at him with those dark, steady eyes. "Thomas was," he started. He stopped. He looked at his hands on the table. "There was a river crossing 3 weeks back. We were moving a herd across the Cimarron up in the territory. The water was running high from all the rain we'd had. Thomas," he stopped again. He had said the man's name twice now, and each time it felt like pressing on something that was not ready to be pressed. He went in to help with a heifer that was struggling in the current and the water. His jaw tightened. "He was pulled under. We looked for him for 2 days. We found him downstream." The clock on the wall ticked 8 times in the silence that followed. Mary's eyes did not fill with tears right away. They went somewhere first, somewhere inward and very far, the way eyes did when a person was recalculating something enormous. When they came back, they were wet at the edges, but she did not cry yet. She looked at Andrew Garrison and he looked back at her, and there was nothing either of them could say that was adequate to the size of what was sitting between them in that warm kitchen. The coffee pot began to steam. She got up and poured 2 cups. She set one in front of him and wrapped both her hands around her own. She sat back down. "Was it quick?" she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Andrew nodded. Yes, ma'am, I believe it was. Did he? She stopped, started again. Was he afraid? He was brave, Andrew said, and this was true. Thomas Rhodes had gone into that water without a second's hesitation because there was a heifer in trouble, and he was the kind of man who did not weigh his own skin against a creature's distress. He was not the kind of man who was afraid. Mary looked down at her coffee. A tear dropped into it and spread. No, she said softly. He was not. They sat in silence for a long time. Andrew drank his coffee because she had made it and she had offered it, and sitting there with an untouched cup seemed worse than drinking it. It was, as people in town apparently said, the best coffee in the county. He would think about that later, about how strange it was that he was noticing the quality of the coffee at a moment like this. Outside, the October afternoon began its slow surrender into evening. The light through the yellow curtains turned from white to gold to amber. The clock kept its patient count. Mary Rhodes sat with her grief and did not ask him to leave, and Andrew Garrison sat with his inadequacy and could not find a reason to go. At some point she got up and added wood to the stove, and the pot of onion and dried beef soup that had been sitting forgotten got stirred and attended to. At some point Andrew got up without asking and brought in more wood from the pile beside the back door because he had seen through the window that the pile inside was getting low and it was getting cold. Neither of them commented on this. It was just a thing that needed doing. She set 2 bowls on the table. "You must be hungry," she said. "You have been riding." "I have," he said, 2 days from Triple Fork." "Then eat," she said, and sat back down. He ate. She ate less, but she tried. They did not talk much, and when they did it was about small things. The route he had taken, the state of the roads, whether the late rains had helped or hurt the fall crops. Ordinary conversation laid carefully over the top of an extraordinary thing, the way a cloth is laid over something that cannot yet be looked at directly. By the time the bowls were cleared and the dishes done and the evening had settled fully into night, Andrew was still there, and neither of them had quite addressed the fact that he was still there. He sat at the kitchen table with a second cup of coffee, and Mary sat across from him, and the silence between them had changed its texture. It was not the silence of strangers anymore. It was not comfortable exactly, but it was honest. "Did you know him well?" she asked. "Thomas." "Well enough," Andrew said. "He was at Triple Fork for about 4 months before the drive. Good worker. Better than most." He paused. "He talked about you, every day almost. He talked about these curtains." He looked at the yellow curtains over the window. "Told me his wife had the finest taste in the territory and that her coffee would ruin a man for every other cup he'd ever drink." Mary made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob, but lived somewhere in the difficult country between them. "He always said that," she said. "Even when the grounds were half gone and the coffee was weak enough to read a newspaper through." "I do not think he was wrong," Andrew said quietly. She looked at him across the table. She was seeing him properly for the first time, she realized, not just as the shape of bad news standing on her porch. He was a person, sitting in her kitchen, who had ridden 2 days out of something that looked a great deal like duty and decency to tell her a thing that no letter could properly carry. He had sat in this kitchen for hours and had not known what to say, and had said it anyway, imperfectly, stumblingly, with his hat in his hands and his words falling apart, and there was something about that imperfection that was more honest than any rehearsed speech could have been. "You did not have to come yourself," she said. "Mr. Briggs could have sent a letter." "Yes, ma'am," Andrew said. "He could have." "Why didn't he?" Andrew was quiet for a moment. "I asked to come," he said. "Thomas and I was the one with him on the crossing. I was the one who pulled him out of the river. I thought—" He stopped. He looked at the table. "I thought someone who was there should be the one to say it." Mary nodded slowly. She looked at the yellow curtains moving slightly in the draft from the window. She thought about Thomas at the Cimarron River, going into the fast water without hesitation because there was something that needed help, because that was simply the kind of man he was, and she felt the grief like a wave that lifted her and set her down and did not break her, not quite, not yet. "Thank you," she said, "for coming yourself." "I am sorry I could not find better words," he said. "There are no better words," she said, "for something like this." He nodded. He looked at her and she looked at him, and the October wind pressed against the windows and the clock ticked and the stove kept the room warm with the wood he had brought in. "It is dark," she said eventually. "You should not ride back tonight." He started to object and she raised one hand slightly. "There is a boarding house 2 streets over," she said. "Mrs. Caulfield runs it. She will have a room. Tell her Mary Rhodes sent you." She paused. "You should stay until morning at least. The roads south are not kind in the dark." He agreed to this because she was right, and because somewhere in the deep practical part of him, he recognized that riding away into the dark Kansas night felt wrong in a way that he could not fully explain. He stayed. He did not leave in the morning either, not first thing. He came back to the house when the sun was barely up, because he had spent the night at Mrs. Caulfield's boarding house, staring at the ceiling and thinking about Mary Rhodes sitting alone in that kitchen with her yellow curtains and her grief. And when morning came, he walked back down the main street and knocked on her door because it seemed like the only sensible direction. She answered in a plain brown dress with her dark hair loose around her shoulders, which meant she had not yet dressed for the day, which meant he had come early enough to catch her before the public version of herself had been assembled. She looked startled for just a moment, and then she looked at him with those dark, steady eyes and stepped back from the door. "I was making breakfast," she said. "Come in." He came in. Over the following days, Andrew Garrison discovered several things about Mary Rhodes that had nothing to do with grief, and everything to do with who she was as a person when grief was not the first thing in the room. He discovered that she was sharp and quick, and that her humor was dry and unexpected in a way that caught him off guard regularly. He discovered that she had strong opinions about the proper way to store root vegetables for winter, and the improper way that her neighbor Mr. Denny managed his fence line, which was, in her assessment, both crooked and an insult to the concept of property lines generally. He discovered that she actually read, not just owned books but read them, and that she had opinions about what she read that she expressed without waiting to be asked. He also discovered that Caldwell, Kansas in October 1878 was not a place that made widowhood easy. Thomas Rhodes had not been a wealthy man, but he had been the man, and without him the house and the small plot of land it sat on, and the future that Mary had been building here, were suddenly precarious in ways that were both practical and social. The practical ways were obvious. There were winter preparations that needed a man's strength, firewood to be split and stacked, a loose board on the roof that wanted fixing before the first hard snow. The social ways were subtler and uglier. There were men in Caldwell who looked at a young widow with a house and a kitchen garden as a kind of opportunity, and not always of the honorable kind. On his 3rd morning in Caldwell, Andrew went to the general store for supplies to fix the roof board, and encountered 2 of those men coming out as he was going in. They were ranch hands from the Deacon's operation east of town, and they had the particular look of men who spent their leisure hours in the saloon and their working hours resenting anyone who seemed to be getting more out of life than they were. They stopped when they saw him and looked him over the way men did when they were calculating their odds. "You the one staying at Caulfield's," the larger one said. "Been seeing you over at the Rhodes place." "I have been," Andrew said pleasantly. He did not slow his stride. "She is a widow woman now," the man said. "Might want to be careful about appearances." Andrew stopped. He turned around slowly and looked at the man. He was a head shorter than Andrew and had the broad, soft look of someone who relied on bluster more than capability. "I am fixing her roof," Andrew said, "before the snow comes. Is there a problem with that?" The man's friend, who was smaller and smarter, put a hand on the larger one's arm. The larger one looked at Andrew for another moment and then looked away. "No problem," he muttered. Andrew went inside the store. He fixed the roof that afternoon, and the loose step on the back porch, and the hinge on the barn door that Mary had mentioned in passing, the kind of mentioning that was not a request but was an observation made to someone who she was beginning to trust with observations. He fixed these things and she brought him coffee while he worked, and they talked easily across the distance of a task. The best kind of talking, Andrew had always thought, the kind that did not require you to look at each other the whole time and could therefore be more honest. "You have been here almost a week," Mary said on the fourth day, handing him a cup through the kitchen window while he worked on the step. "You must have work to go back to." "I do," he said. He tested the step with his weight and it held. "I have been sending word to Briggs. He knows where I am." She looked at him through the window. "Why," she said, "not why are you still here, but why in the fuller sense that contained the entire situation." He turned to look at her. The morning light was direct and honest, and it lit the side of her face and the dark fall of her hair, and the way she was leaning against the window frame with the coffee cup held in both hands. He had been asking himself the same question every morning when he woke up at Caulfield's boarding house, lying on the narrow mattress looking at the ceiling. Why was he still here? He had delivered the news. He had done what he had come to do. He could go. He could ride south on the Kisham Road and be back at Triple Fork by the following evening and resume the life he had been living before he rode into Caldwell. He did not have a clean answer for why he had not done that yet. "It is getting colder," he said. "You have more winter preparation to do than you can manage alone." "I managed the last 2 winters," she said. "Thomas was here for the last 2 winters," he said gently. She looked down at her coffee. "Yes," she said quietly. "He was." He looked at the step he had repaired. "I would like to stay a little while longer," he said, "if you do not object." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I will make lunch," which was not an objection. He stayed. The days organized themselves around the natural rhythms of homestead work and the rhythms of 2 people getting to know each other in the slow, honest way that came from proximity and shared labor. They split firewood in the mornings, or rather Andrew split and Mary stacked, and they talked while they worked. They ate meals together, which began as a practical arrangement and became something else without either of them naming it. In the evenings, Mary read by the lamp and Andrew sat across the table from her mending tack or sharpening tools he had borrowed from her shed. And sometimes they talked, and sometimes they did not, and the silence was the comfortable kind. He learned that she had come from a town called Lexington, Missouri, where her father had been a merchant and her mother had died when Mary was 12, and that she had helped raise her 2 younger brothers after that, which explained some of the competence and practicality she wore so naturally. He learned that she had met Thomas Rhodes at a church social when she was 19 and married him at 20, which meant she had spent essentially her entire adult life as his wife. He learned that she grieved Thomas genuinely and deeply, and that she was not the kind of person who hid grief or dressed it up as something else, but that she also was not the kind of person who let grief consume her functioning, because there was a house to maintain and a winter coming, and no one was going to do it for her. He also learned that she was watching him, not in the way of a woman calculating a replacement for a dead husband, which was a thing he had been careful not to assume, but in the way of someone who was trying to understand a person who had appeared in her life unexpectedly and had not yet explained their full dimensions. She asked him questions, good ones, the kind that could not be answered with yes or no. She asked him where he had grown up and what had brought him to Kansas, and what he thought about and what he wanted, and she listened to the answers with the kind of attention that made a person feel that what they said mattered. He had grown up in Virginia, he told her, the son of a tobacco farmer. He had come west at 23 after the farm failed in the economic collapse of the early 70s, following the railroad, and then the cattle trail until he found foreman work at Triple Fork, which was well-paying and suited him, because he was good with animals and better with the kind of problem-solving that came from managing a large operation and the complicated human beings within it. He had never married. He had never, if he was being honest with himself, met someone who made him want to stay in one place long enough to learn if marriage was a thing he was capable of. He said most of this to Mary Rhodes on a cold evening in the second week of October while they sat at her kitchen table with coffee and a lamp turned low, and when he was done he felt exposed in a way that was not entirely uncomfortable, which was itself surprising. "You are 31, she said. She was not judging him, she was placing him. "Yes," he said. "You have been alone a long time," she said. He considered this. "I suppose I have," he said. "I did not always notice it." "Do you notice it now?" she said. He looked at her across the lamp light. Her dark eyes were steady and direct, the way they always were, and her question was honest, the way her questions always were, and he thought about the morning he had woken up at Caulfield's, and the thought of riding south had felt like leaving something unfinished. He thought about the way the kitchen smelled when she made coffee in the mornings. He thought about the way she laughed, that dry, unexpected laugh, when he said something that caught her off guard. He thought about all of this and looked at her and said, truthfully, "Yes. I notice it now." Neither of them said anything after that for a while, but something had shifted in the room and they both knew it. The social world of Caldwell, Kansas had opinions about Andrew Garrison's continued presence at the Rhodes homestead, and those opinions ranged from neighborly approval to pointed speculation. And occasionally those opinions expressed themselves in ways that required navigation. The most direct expression of those opinions came from a woman named Beatrice Hollies, who ran the town's small lending library out of the back of the general store, and who had appointed herself the community's moral ledger. She intercepted Mary one morning at the store while Andrew was at the livery seeing to his horse, and she said, in the tone of someone delivering a charitable warning, that people were talking about the amount of time a strange man was spending at a widow's house not 3 weeks after she had received news of her husband's death. Mary bought her flour and her lamp oil and said to Beatrice Hollies that she was certain Beatrice was only trying to be helpful, and that Beatrice's concern was noted, and that Andrew Garrison had come to deliver news that required decency and had stayed to help with work that required strength, and that she was satisfied with the arrangements in her own home, and she thanked Beatrice for the conversation and walked out. She told Andrew about it that evening with the dry, matter-of-fact delivery that was characteristic of her, and he listened carefully and then asked how she felt about it, and she said she was not in the habit of running her household according to Beatrice Hollies' catalog of approved behaviors. Andrew said that was reasonable. Then he said that if there was anything in his continued presence that made her situation harder rather than easier, he would go. He said this with genuine seriousness, not as a performative offer he expected her to refuse. Mary looked at him and said, "If I wanted you to go, Andrew, I would tell you." It was the first time she had called him by his given name. They both noticed it. "All right," he said. The winter preparations continued. Andrew split and stacked enough wood to see her through to March. He repaired the barn roof with timber he hauled from the lumber yard. He helped her harvest the last of the kitchen garden, pulling the dried stalks and turning the soil and planting the garlic that would winter over and come up first in the spring. He was not a man who had ever particularly thought about gardening, having grown up on a tobacco farm and spent his adult years in saddles and bunkhouses. But he found that he did not mind it, the work of preparing things to endure and come back. Mary worked beside him through all of it, and they were a good working pair, efficient and easy in each other's company, anticipating each other's next moves with increasing frequency, until Mrs. Caulfield, who walked past on her way to the store one afternoon, and saw them working in the kitchen garden with the fluid coordination of people who had been doing something together for years, remarked to no one in particular that it was something to see. Andrew stayed 3 weeks before they spoke plainly about what was happening between them. It was a Saturday evening, late October, and the first real cold of the season had come down from the north, and the town was quiet outside, and the fire in the stove was going well, and they were sitting at the kitchen table after supper, which had been a good meal because Mary was a genuinely skilled cook, and she had more to work with than onions and dried beef tonight. Andrew set down his coffee cup and looked at the table for a moment and then looked up at her. "Mary," he said. She had been watching him think about saying something and had been waiting with a patience that did not show its edges. "Yes," she said. "I want to be honest with you," he said. "You have been honest with me," she said. "That is why you are still here." He looked at her. "I do not want you to think that I came here and stayed here because I was looking for—" He stopped, reorganized. "You are a widow. You are grieving. I do not want you to think that I—" "Andrew," she said, and her voice was gentle but direct. "Say what you mean to say." He pressed his lips together. Then he said it plain. "I have feelings for you," he said. "I did not expect them, and I am not sure what to do with them, and I know that the timing is terrible, and I know that you are still grieving, and I know that I am probably the last person you need making declarations, but I am not capable of sitting in this kitchen with you every evening and not being honest about what is happening to me." He paused. "And I thought you deserved to know what is happening to me." The fire moved in the stove. The clock ticked. The wind worked at the windows. Mary looked at him across the table for a long moment. Her expression was not surprised, exactly. It was more like the expression of someone who has been watching something approach for some time and has been waiting to see if it would actually arrive or change course. "Thomas has been gone a month," she said. She said it not as a rebuke but as a naming of the reality. "I know," Andrew said. "I know. I love Thomas," she said. "I want you to know that. I will not pretend otherwise." "I know that too," he said. "I would not ask you to pretend otherwise. He was a good man." She was quiet. She looked down at her hands on the table. "I have feelings too," she said softly. "I did not expect them either. And you are right, the timing it is not what I would have chosen." She looked up at him. "But I am not going to lie to you about what is happening to me either, because you have been honest with me from the beginning, even when you could not find the words, and I think that deserves honesty back." He looked at her steadily. "What do you want to do?" he said. "I do not know yet," she said. "I think I need time. I think this needs time." She paused. "But I do not want you to leave." He nodded. He looked at her with those gray-green eyes that had been so full of pain on the day he rode into town, and were now full of something different, something that was careful and warm and entirely sincere. "I am not going anywhere," he said. She reached across the table and put her hand over his briefly, for just a moment, and then drew it back. The fire in the stove kept the room warm and the clock kept its patient count, and outside the October wind was pushing winter down from the north. But inside the kitchen with the yellow curtains it was warm enough, and that was enough for now. November arrived with purpose and cold, the kind of cold that had texture to it, that you could feel on the back of your neck and the tips of your fingers even inside a well-built house. Andrew sent a second letter to Holt Briggs, and this time he was more frank. He said he would be in Caldwell through the winter, and that he understood if Briggs needed to hire another foreman, and that he was sorry for the inconvenience. Briggs wrote back within 2 weeks, which was fast mail for the territory, and the letter said that Andrew Garrison was the best foreman he had employed in 15 years, and that the job would be waiting when he came back, and that Briggs hoped his reasons for staying were good ones, and that if they involved the widow of Thomas Rhodes, then Holt, Briggs thought Thomas would not have objected, which was the closest that a man like Briggs was going to come to a blessing. Andrew read this letter at the boarding house and sat with it for a while and thought about Thomas Rhodes, whom he had known for 4 months, and who had talked about his wife and her coffee and her yellow curtains with a love that had been straightforward and completely without self-consciousness. He thought about pulling Thomas out of the Cimarron River, and the days that followed and the ride north to Caldwell, and the porch with its uncertain knock, and the kitchen that had been warm and steady and honest since the moment he entered it. He thought about Mary's hand on his, just for that moment. He folded the letter and put it in his coat pocket and went to her house for breakfast. The town of Caldwell adjusted its opinion of Andrew Garrison over the course of November, the way small towns did when a person proved consistently useful and did not do anything dramatically wrong. He helped old Mr. Keogh repair his fence after a windstorm took 3 panels. He helped the blacksmith, a taciturn man named Burl Fletcher, haul a seized wagon out of the mud on the South Road. He was seen at church on Sundays sitting in the second row with Mary Rhodes, which in 1878 in Kansas communicated something specific to everyone in the building. And what it communicated was not improper because he sat at a respectable distance and behaved with impeccable decorum, and because Mary Rhodes was a woman who commanded a certain respect in this community even in her grief, perhaps especially in her grief. Beatrice Hollis revised her opinion without announcing that she had done so, which was the way of such revisions in small towns. She simply stopped expressing concern and started nodding pleasantly when Andrew passed her on the street, which in Beatrice's moral vocabulary was a significant upgrade. The deacon's ranch hands from the general store did not revise their opinion, but they did stop expressing it, which was all Andrew required. Mary went through her grief with the honesty and steadiness that characterized everything she did. She did not hide from it or hurry it, but she also did not let it be the only thing she was. She had 2 brothers in Missouri who she wrote to regularly, informing them of what had happened and that she was managing, and that there was a good man in town who had helped her considerably, and that they should not worry. The younger brother, Daniel, wrote back asking if this good man had intentions, which was the kind of direct question that ran in their family evidently, and Mary wrote back that she did not know yet, and that she would tell him when she did. In the evenings she and Andrew read together by the lamp, companionably, and they talked about the books and about the news that came through the Caldwell newspaper and about the state of things generally. He told her about the cattle drives he had been on, the long months on the trail from Texas north, the way the sky looked over the Kishom when you had been riding for 6 weeks, and the grass went all the way to the horizon in every direction. She told him about Missouri and her childhood and the brothers she had helped raise and the mother she had lost young, and he listened to all of it with the attention she had first given him and that he was now giving back. One evening in the middle of November she came back from town with a look on her face that told him something had happened, and she set her basket on the table and sat down and told him that there was a lawyer in town, newly arrived from Wichita, who had been appointed to settle the estate of Thomas Rhodes, such as it was. Thomas had had a small policy with the Kansas Mutual Aid Society, the kind that working men paid into, so that their families would not be completely stranded if the worst happened. The policy was small, but it was real, and it was Mary's, and the lawyer needed her signature on several documents. This was practical news, and she delivered it practically, but Andrew could see what it was costing her, the formalization of Thomas's death into documents and signatures, the way the law converted a person into an estate and a loss into a transaction. He sat across from her and let her talk through it and did not try to fix it or rush past it. "It is strange," she said, "having to sign your name to something that makes it official, as if it were not already official." "I know," he said. "The policy will give me enough to see through the winter," she said, "and part of the spring, but after that," she stopped. She was not asking him to solve it. She was just thinking out loud, the way she had come to do with him, the way people did with someone they trusted. "I will need to decide what I am doing." Andrew nodded. He looked at the kitchen, at the warm stove and the yellow curtains and the shelves of well-organized jars and the polished cast iron and all the carefully assembled details of a life that was fully and completely hers. He thought about what he had to offer and whether he had any right to offer it and whether the timing was right and whether there was any timing that was ever truly right for anything that mattered. "Mary," he said. She looked at him. "I am not going to pretend that I have not been thinking about your situation," he said, "and I am not going to pretend that my thinking is entirely practical." He kept his eyes on her. "I have been thinking about what you need and what I want to offer and whether those are the same thing, and I do not think they are perfectly the same thing, which means I do not want you to think I am proposing something because of your situation." He paused. "But I want you to know that I have thought about it." She was watching him with that steady, direct gaze. "What have you thought?" she said. He breathed in. "That I would like to stay," he said, "not just through the winter. That I would like to stay in a way that is real and permanent. that I would like to ask you when you are ready, when enough time has passed for it to be the right thing, if you would consider marrying me." He kept his voice even and honest, not pressuring, not performing. "Not because you need someone, but because I would like to be the person you spend your life with if you would have me." The November wind moved against the windows. The stove breathed its warmth through the room. The clock on the wall marked the passage of seconds in the silence. Mary looked at him. Her eyes were bright, but she did not cry. She was thinking, genuinely thinking, and he could see it happening in the way her expression moved through a series of careful considerations that she was not hiding from him. "I am still grieving," she said. "I know," he said. "I am not asking you to stop. I am not asking you for an answer now." "I need more time," she said. "I have time," he said, and then, quietly, "I am not going anywhere." She looked at him for another long moment. Then she said, "All right," and that was enough for now, and they both knew it was enough. December came, and with it the first real snow, which fell on Caldwell in a slow, thick curtain that muffled the town and made everything look provisional and temporary in a way that was somehow beautiful rather than threatening. Andrew woke at Caulfield's to find the world white and new, and walked through the quiet streets to Mary's house with snow collecting on his hat and shoulders. She was already up and the fire was going, and she had coffee made when he knocked, and she opened the door and looked at him standing in the snow with his hat dusted white and his coat dark with damp, and said, "You are going to track that inside." He looked down at his boots. "I will wipe them," he said. "See that you do," she said, and stepped back from the door, and there was something in the ordinary bickering ease of that exchange that was better than a declaration. He wiped his boots and came in, and she gave him coffee, and he gave her a proper look at the snow from the front window, and they stood side by side looking at the white Caldwell morning through the yellow curtains, and neither of them said anything for a while, because there was nothing that needed saying. December brought its other business too. There was a Christmas service at the church that they attended together, properly together now, with no more pretense about the exact nature of their situation, since everyone in Caldwell had long since made up their own mind about it. The preacher, a good-natured man named Reverend Caldecott, who was nothing like Beatrice Holly's in temperament, shook Andrew's hand at the door after the service and said that it was good to see a man take proper care of a neighbor. Mary's younger brother Daniel wrote again from Missouri, a longer letter this time, saying he was considering a visit come spring. He said he trusted his sister's judgment in all things, and that if she said the man was good, then he was certain the man was good, but that he also intended to come and see for himself, because he was her younger brother and that was his right. Mary read this letter aloud to Andrew at the kitchen table, and Andrew listened with the serious attention of a man who understood that a younger brother's opinion was not something to be taken lightly. "He will like you," Mary said. "You think so?" Andrew said. "You are practical and honest, and you do not say more than you mean," she said. "Daniel respects those things." Andrew nodded. He felt something warm and settling at the idea of being assessed by her family, at the idea of having a family to be assessed by. He had been alone a long time in the way that men in his profession were alone, surrounded by other men, but without the particular intimacy of a household, a family, people who knew him well enough to have opinions about him that they would defend to strangers. The thought of Daniel Rhodes coming to Caldwell in the spring to look him over was not alarming. It was something closer to welcome. January was the hardest month, as January in Kansas was always the hardest month. The cold was serious and sustained and did not ease for apology. They spent more time inside, which meant more time at the kitchen table with books and coffee, and the particular intimacy of the indoors in winter. Andrew had moved from the boarding house. By then, Mrs. Caulfield had quietly let it be known that she was not judging, and that Mary Rhodes was a woman of good character, and that whatever the arrangement was, it was none of her concern, which was Caulfield's way of approving, and he was sleeping in the small room off the barn that had been a storeroom, and that he had converted with considerable effort and some creative carpentry into something habitable. It was cold, but it was his, And every morning he came into the warm kitchen, and Mary handed him coffee, and they had breakfast together, and it was, Andrew thought, the most domestic and settled he had ever felt in his life. He woke one January morning to find the barn storeroom door frozen shut by the overnight cold and had to push it open with his shoulder. And when he came into the kitchen stamping and blowing steam, Mary took one look at him and said, with the dry humor that still caught him off guard, "You look like a man who has reconsidered his living arrangements." "I am perfectly comfortable," he said, which they both knew was completely untrue. "There is a spare room," she said. It was Thomas's workroom. "The cot in there is serviceable." He looked at her. He understood that she was offering practical accommodation and that she was also, on some level, offering him something larger, a more complete admission of what they were becoming to each other. He also understood the delicacy of it. "What would Beatrice Hollis say?" he said. "I stopped caring what Beatrice Hollis says sometime around the middle of November," Mary said. "Sit down, your coffee is getting cold." He moved into the workroom. It had a small window that looked out over the kitchen garden, and a cot that was indeed serviceable and a hook on the back of the door for his coat. And it was warm because it shared a wall with the kitchen stove. And it was hers in the way that everything in this house was hers, thought about and arranged with care and purpose. He slept better than he had since arriving in Caldwell, which he attributed partly to the warmth and partly to something harder to name. In February, something happened that had been building since the Deacon's ranch hands had looked him over in front of the general store. A man named Cord Deakins, son of the ranch owner and someone who had apparently had his own eyes on the Rhodes property since before Thomas had even gone south to Triple Fork, came to the house on a cold Tuesday morning with the look of a man who had decided to make his position clear. He knocked on the door, and when Mary answered he told her, with his hat on his head and no particular courtesy, that he was aware she was sitting on a productive homestead, and that he was prepared to make her a fair offer for it, because it was a hard thing for a woman alone to maintain, and he thought she would be better off with cash in hand, and the situation resolved. He said this like it was a favor he was doing her. Mary looked at him for a moment. Andrew came around from the side of the house where he had been working on the fence and stopped when he saw the scene at the door. He read the situation quickly and clearly. "There anything I can help with?" he said. Cord Deakins turned and looked at Andrew. He was a big man, heavy through the shoulders, with his father's habit of standing slightly too close to people. He looked Andrew up and down. "This is between me and Mrs. Rhodes," Deakins said. "The lady lives here," Andrew said evenly. "I live here. That makes it between you and both of us." Deakins looked from Andrew to Mary and back again. He was calculating clearly the distance between his bluster and whatever this tall, steady-eyed man might actually do. He was the kind of man who measured others by whether they would blink, and Andrew Garrison did not blink. "My offer stands," Deakins said to Mary. He reset his hat on his head and walked back to his horse. Mary watched him go. Then she turned to Andrew and said, "He has been making that offer, or variations of it, since Thomas left." "I will be here when he makes the next one," Andrew said. She looked at him with an expression that was complicated and warm at the same time. "I know you will," she said. She never accepted Cord Deakins's offer. She never came close. This was a homestead that Thomas had built with his own hands, and that she had made into a home with her own care. And she was not selling it to a man who thought women should be grateful for the chance to get out from under what they owned. March came slowly and then all at once. The way spring arrived in Kansas, one week there was still ice on the water trough, and the next week the south wind came up warm and insistent, and the ground smelled like itself again, like dirt and potential, and Mary's kitchen garden put up its first green against the dark soil like small brave flags. One evening in the middle of March, when the days had grown long enough to stay light past supper and the windows could be opened a crack without inviting frostbite, Mary put down her book and looked across the table at Andrew and said, "I think I am ready." He looked up from the tack he was mending. "To answer you," she said, "the question you asked in November." He set down the tack and looked at her fully. "I loved Thomas," she said, and her voice was clear and steady. "And I will love him all my life in the way that a person loves someone who helped make them who they are. But he is gone." She paused. "And you are here. And you have been here through all of it, through the grief and the winter and the frozen door and Cord Deacons and Beatrice Hollies and every other inconvenient thing, and you have been honest with me every day. And I have been happy," she said, and that word seemed to surprise her slightly even as she said it, as if she had not expected to find it true. "I have been happy, Andrew, these last months. You have made me happy." He looked at her. His chest felt full of something that had been building since October and had become, over the course of 5 months of coffee and firewood and frozen doors and dry humor and lamplight conversations, into something large and essential and entirely certain. "Is that a yes?" he said, and his voice was quiet and careful because he was not going to presume. "Yes," she said. "It is." He stood up from his chair and she stood from hers. And for a moment they just looked at each other across the kitchen table, with the lamp between them and the window open to the March air, and the whole of whatever came next spread out before them like the Kansas prairie at first light. Then he came around the table and she came toward him, and he took her face in his hands the way a man handled something valuable and irreplaceable, and he kissed her for the first time, a slow, honest kiss that tasted like coffee, and had the weight of 5 months of patience and care behind it. When they drew back, her eyes were bright and his hands were still on her face, and neither of them said anything, because for the first time since Andrew Garrison had ridden into Caldwell with a hat in his hands and no words for what he had come to say, there was nothing that needed saying. They were married in May of 1879, on a Saturday morning when the prairie was in full green, and the sky was that deep Kansas blue, and the cottonwoods along the creek were in young leaf, and the whole world had the quality of a beginning. Reverend Caldecott performed the ceremony in the church, and the whole town came, which was the nature of small towns in the territory, and the reception was held in the yard of the homestead that Thomas Rhodes had built and Mary had kept, and that was now also Andrew's in the way that all good things shared between two people became both of theirs, without ceasing to be what they were before. Daniel Rhodes had arrived 3 weeks earlier from Missouri, as promised, and he had looked Andrew over with the assessing eye of a younger brother who took his responsibilities seriously. Daniel was 24 and quick, and had his sister's dry humor and her directness. And on the second day of his visit, he had taken Andrew aside after breakfast and told him plainly that Mary was the best person he knew, and that the man who had his sister's happiness in his hands had best prove equal to the responsibility. Andrew had looked Daniel Rhodes in the eye and said that he intended to spend every day of his life being equal to it, and Daniel had been quiet for a moment and then had nodded once, the nod of a man who had gotten what he came for. At the wedding, Daniel stood at the front of the church and watched his sister walk toward a man who looked at her the way a man should look at a woman he was marrying, with complete attention and open feeling, nothing held back, nothing performed. Later at the reception, Daniel found Andrew standing at the edge of the yard looking at the kitchen garden and the new shoots coming up through the dark-turned soil, and Daniel stood beside him with a glass of lemonade and said nothing for a while and then said, "I think you are going to be all right." Andrew smiled. "I think we are," he said. The spring and summer of 1879 were good ones. Andrew wrote to Holt Briggs and told him he would not be coming back to Triple Fork, that he was married now and intending to put down roots in Caldwell. And Briggs wrote back with congratulations, and the name of a man in Wichita who was looking for an experienced foreman for a smaller operation that would let Andrew be home more nights than not. Andrew wrote to the man in Wichita and had work arranged by June, which was cattle work still but different, closer to home, with regular days off and the particular freedom that came from having a home to come back to. Coming back to the house in the evenings after a day's work, and finding the lamp lit in the window, and the smell of Mary's cooking coming under the door, was something that Andrew Garrison did not think he would ever take for granted, because he had spent too many years coming back to bunkhouses and boarding rooms to make that mistake. He always stopped for a moment on the porch before he went in, just to appreciate it. Mary found that marriage to Andrew felt different from what she had expected, not worse, but different in a way that surprised her pleasantly. She had been married to Thomas for 7 years, and she had known the rhythms of that marriage so well that she had stopped noticing them, the way you stop noticing the sound of the creek when you have lived beside it long enough. With Andrew there was newness still, the interest of learning someone thoroughly, the small discoveries of habit and preference and interior life that came from living closely with a person. He was orderly where Thomas had been chaotic. He was quiet where Thomas had been expansive. He thought before he spoke where Thomas had spoken and sorted it out afterward. These were not better or worse. They were different, and different was interesting. She also discovered that he was surprisingly good at the domestic details of homestead life for a man who had spent 8 years in bunkhouses and on the trail. He kept his things clean and organized. He could cook 3 things competently, which was 3 things more than she had expected. He fed her chickens without being asked when she was busy with something else. When she was sick in July with a summer cold that knocked her flat for 4 days, he managed the household with a quiet competence that made her lie in bed slightly marveling at the practical dimensions of the man she had married. "Where did you learn to make chicken soup?" she asked him on the 3rd day when the cold was retreating and she was sitting up and eating. "My mother," he said. He sat on the edge of the bed and watched her eat with the focused attention of someone who needed to be sure she was actually eating. "She made it every winter. I watched her enough times that I absorbed it." "It is good," she said. "It is not as good as yours," he said. "Nothing is as good as mine," she said, with the dry certainty that still made him grin. The autumn of 1879 brought news that made Mary sit very still at the kitchen table for a full minute, the kind of stillness that had a different quality from grief, something that was its own distinct country. She was pregnant. The doctor in Caldwell confirmed it in October, almost exactly a year after Andrew had ridden into town with his hat in his hands, and no words for what he had come to say. She told Andrew that evening by the stove, sitting across the kitchen table with coffee between them in the way she had told him a great many important things, because the kitchen table with coffee between them had become the place where they were most honestly themselves. She told him plainly and watched his face, and what happened to his face was something she saved in the part of her memory she kept carefully. He looked at her for a moment, and then he put his face in his hands and breathed for a moment, not in distress, but in the way that people sometimes had to breathe when something too large for ordinary expression arrived. When he looked up, his eyes were wet at the edges and his jaw was set, but his expression was entirely open, entirely unguarded, entirely full. "Mary," he said, just her name. Nothing else was there. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. "I know," she said. "I know." He turned his hand over under hers and held on. The winter of 1879 into 1880 was a good winter, full and warm and busy with preparation of a different kind than the previous years. Mary was not a woman who required fussing over, and she made this clear regularly. But she permitted Andrew a certain amount of attention that she would not have permitted from anyone else, the kind of attention that expressed itself in making sure the coffee was ready when she came downstairs, and that the path to the outhouse was clear of ice, and that the load of firewood was never low. She grew in the way that pregnant women grew, steadily and without drama, and she continued to do the work of the house and the garden in the modified way that sensibility required. She wrote to Daniel in Missouri, who wrote back with enthusiasm, and the announcement that he had met a girl named Clara who he thought his sister would like very much and who he was considering asking to marry him. Mary wrote back that she thought that was wonderful and that she looked forward to meeting Clara, and that he had her blessing for whatever he needed her blessing for, and also that she was 3 months along and doing well. The baby was born in June of 1880, a boy. Andrew was present for the birth, which was not universally common in that time but which Mary had not left as a question. She had told him plainly that she wanted him there, and he had been there, steady and present and not in the way, with the midwife Mrs. Harmon directing operations, and Andrew sitting at the head of the bed holding Mary's hand with both of his and not letting go. The labor was long but not difficult, at least by the standards of the time, and when the boy arrived red and emphatic and announcing himself to the world with considerable volume, Andrew made a sound that he would have been embarrassed by if he had been aware of it, a low broken sound of relief and wonder that Mrs. Harmon, who had attended a great many births, recognized and did not comment on. They named him Thomas Andrew Garrison. Thomas for the man who had built this house and who would be remembered in it, and Andrew for the man who lived in it now and was building something new within its walls. Mary had suggested the name, and Andrew had looked at her when she said it, understanding what she was offering him, the joining of what had been and what was now, the acknowledgement that love did not always require you to choose between your histories. "Are you sure?" he said. "He deserves to know where this house came from," she said. "And so do you." He nodded. He looked at the baby in her arms, small and particular and entirely real, and said, "Thomas Andrew," and the name sat right in his mouth in a way that told him she had been right. Little Thomas was a robust child who had, from the earliest age, his mother's stubbornness and his father's patience in some improbable combination that made him simultaneously easy to like and difficult to argue with. He had dark eyes that were clearly his mother's, and a temperament that was all his own, curious and physical and thoroughly interested in every living thing that came within his reach. The house on the north end of Caldwell's Main Street expanded the following year with an addition that Andrew built himself, the way Thomas Rhodes had built the original structure, plank by plank and post by post, working in the evenings and on weekends with Daniel Rhodes, who had come out for a visit with his new wife Clara, as promised, and who proved to be nearly as good with a hammer as Andrew himself. Daniel and Clara Rhodes settled in Caldwell by the end of 1881, deciding that the Kansas prairie was a reasonable place to start a life, which Mary said she had suspected would happen when she met Clara, and saw that Clara had that particular practical look of a woman who could make a life anywhere as long as the person she was making it with was worth it. Having her brother in town, having family nearby for the first time since she had left Missouri, was something that Mary had not known she missed until it was returned to her. She and Clara became close with the ease of women who recognized good character in each other quickly and did not waste time on preliminaries. The two households were in and out of each other daily in the way of families who liked each other as well as loved each other. Andrew and Daniel had the companionable ease of men who had been assessed by each other and found each other acceptable. They worked together on projects and argued about cattle and the railroad and the state of Kansas politics with the pleasure of men who enjoyed a good argument more than they enjoyed agreement. When Daniel and Clara had their first child, a girl they named Louisa, in the spring of 1882, Andrew was the one who went and got the doctor in the middle of the night, and Mary was the one in the room with Clara through the whole of it. And afterward Andrew and Daniel sat on the porch in the early morning light with coffee, which was Mary's coffee and therefore, as advertised, the best in the county, and said nothing for a long time because the night had been tense and the morning was good, and sometimes that was all that needed to be said. In the autumn of 1882, Mary told Andrew she was pregnant again. He was in the barn when she came to find him, and she said it the same way she had said it the first time, plainly, watching his face. His face did the same thing it had done the first time, the same quality of something too large for ordinary expression arriving all at once. "Another one," he said. His voice had that low note that she had come to know as his version of deep feeling. "Another one," she confirmed. He crossed the barn and put his arms around her and held on, which he did not do in public but did with complete willingness in private, and she put her face against his shoulder, and they stood there in the barn with the smell of hay and horses around them and the October afternoon light coming through the boards. "What do you think?" he said. "Boy or girl?" "I think it is none of our business to predict," she said. "We will know when we know." "That is very sensible," he said. "I am a very sensible woman," she said into his shoulder. "The most sensible I have ever met," he said. The second child was a girl, born in April of 1883, and they named her Grace Ellen Garrison Grace, because it seemed right in Ellen for Mary's mother, who had died when Mary was 12, and who had been, by all accounts, a woman of considerable character and the specific kind of beauty that has more to do with how a person moves through the world than with features. Grace Ellen Garrison had red-brown hair that neither of her parents could fully account for and eyes that started dark, and then changed to a clear brown, and a disposition, from the first weeks of such sunny certainty, about the world that the household arranged itself instinctively around her cheerfulness. Thomas, who was 3 and operating at peak intensity, required a period of adjustment to the new presence in his life. He circled the baby with the assessing intensity of a small person encountering something that was claiming attention he felt he had some rights to. And then one morning he placed his toy horse carefully in the cradle beside her and said to Andrew, who was watching from the doorway, "She can use it." This was determined to be enough. The homestead of Andrew and Mary Garrison in Caldwell, Kansas by the mid-1880s was a busy and good place. The addition Andrew had built gave them proper room for the children. The kitchen garden was large and productive under Mary's management. The yellow curtains were still in the front window. They had been replaced twice, but always with yellow, because Mary liked them, and because Andrew had ridden into town with no words, and those curtains had been the first specific thing he had known about her home, and they would stay, as far as he was concerned, as long as the house stood. Andrew's work with the smaller operation out of Wichita had given way by 1883 to his own smaller cattle brokerage, operating out of Caldwell itself. He had enough knowledge of the trade and enough reliable relationships in the industry to make a viable go of it, and the business grew steadily, if not dramatically. Mary was his first and most important advisor, not because she knew cattle particularly, but because she knew people and she knew numbers, and she had the kind of practical intelligence that cut through the decorative parts of a business problem to the structural reality, which was the most useful kind. They worked together on the books in the evenings after the children were in bed, at the kitchen table with coffee between them, and it was in those evenings that Andrew felt most fully the dimensions of what he had found, of what had begun in this same kitchen on an October afternoon 5 years earlier, when a woman he had never met had invited a stranger in because he could not find his words, and she had made him coffee and given him time to find them. He told her this one evening, looking up from the ledger at her across the table, the lamp between them and the October wind at the windows again, the anniversary of it coming back around. "Do you remember," he said, "the first day?" She looked up from her own papers. "I remember," she said. "I had ridden 2 days and rehearsed what to say the whole way, and not one word was still there when you opened the door," he said. "I know," she said. "I could see that. That is why I made coffee." "It was the right thing to do," he said. She smiled at him. She had the same dark, steady eyes and the same dry directness she had had in October of 1878. And 5 years of marriage and children and hard winters and good seasons had given her something else as well, a warmth that was less guarded than it had been, not because she had become less careful, but because she had found something worth being unguarded with. "I usually do the right thing," she said. "Yes," he said, "you do." He looked at her with the gray-green eyes that had been full of pain when she first saw them and were now full of something so different that it occupied an entirely different part of the vocabulary. "You always have." She looked at him for a moment. The fire in the stove moved. The clock on the wall, the same clock that had ticked through that first long, painful afternoon, kept its patient count. The yellow curtains were still in the window. "Andrew," she said. "Yes," he said. "I am glad you could not find the words," she said softly. He looked at her. He knew what she meant. If he had found the words, if he had been able to say what he came to say on that porch and then turn and ride south again, none of this would exist. Not the kitchen with its lamp and its coffee and its years of evening conversations. Not Thomas, asleep in the back room with his toy horses and his mother's stubbornness. Not Grace, who had changed the household's emotional weather to permanent June the moment she arrived. Not Daniel and Clara 2 streets over. Not any of it. "I am too," he said. "Every day." She got up from her chair and came around the table, and he turned his chair toward her, and she sat on the edge of it beside him, the way she did sometimes in the evenings when the children were asleep, and the house was quiet, and they did not need the distance of the table between them. He put his arm around her, and she leaned against his shoulder, and they sat like that for a while, in the warm kitchen with the lamp burning low and the October wind outside, and the small sounds of the sleeping house around them. Outside in Caldwell, Kansas, 1883, the world was still changing. The cattle trade was transforming as the railroad spread and the open range closed. The wild of the West was being steadily, irreversibly domesticated by the arrival of more people and more law and more permanence. The days of the long drives and the open prairie and the particular freedom and danger of the frontier were not gone yet, but they were going, and men who had lived that life were finding themselves at a crossroads that not all of them navigated gracefully. Andrew had navigated it by stopping, and by stopping in this particular place, and by finding that what he had stopped for was worth everything he had traded for it. He did not miss the trail with any ache that troubled him. He missed it the way a person missed youth, with affection and without regret, understanding that the thing you have now required the thing you had before, and that the exchange was fair. Mary had navigated it by not giving way to the forces that wanted to simplify her, to reduce her to a widow who needed managing, or a homestead that needed buying, or a community resource who needed directing. She had remained entirely herself through every pressure and every season and every iteration of Caldwell's opinion about her, and she had made of her life something that was both shaped by loss and not defined by it, which was perhaps the most courageous domestic achievement Andrew Garrison had ever witnessed. Spring of 1884 brought Daniel's second child, a boy this time, named James, who arrived with great ceremony and immediately staked his claim on every available adult's attention in both households. Thomas Garrison, now 4 and in full possession of his personality, received his new cousin with the magnanimity of a senior person dealing with a junior one, and extended to James the formal courtesy of showing him, at the earliest possible opportunity, how to properly handle a toy horse. Clara and Daniel were entirely absorbed and entirely happy. Mary told Andrew in the late summer of 1884 that she thought she might be expecting a third time, and she said it with the same directness she had said the first 2 times, and watched his face, and his face did what it always did, the large thing arriving, the openness, the fullness. 3, he said. 3, she confirmed. Mary Rhodes, he said. He had called her that occasionally from the beginning, not because he forgot her married name, but because it was the name she had been when he met her, and it carried all of it, the afternoon and the coffee and the yellow curtains and everything that had grown from them. "Andrew Garrison," she said back in the same tone. He reached across the table and took her hand. They sat like that for a while, in the kitchen where it had all begun, in the house that was fully and completely theirs now, in the life that had been built from an October afternoon and a cup of coffee, and the honest inadequacy of a man who could not find his words, until a woman gave him time to find them. The third child arrived in the spring of 1885, a boy with his father's gray-green eyes and his mother's determination, and they named him Daniel James Garrison for no better reason than that Daniel Rhodes had come to the delivery, as he always did, and sat on the porch through the whole of it with Andrew, drinking Mary's coffee and talking about everything except what was happening inside the house, which was the strategy they had developed over 2 children each and found to be the most effective approach to the specific anxiety of waiting. When Mrs. Harmon came to the door and said it was a boy and that Mary was well, Daniel said to Andrew, "Third time," and Andrew said, "Third time," and they sat with it for a moment, and then Andrew went inside. Mary was tired and beautiful and holding the baby with the particular practiced ease of a woman on her 3rd child. She looked up when Andrew came in, and her dark eyes found him across the room immediately, the way they always did, with the directness and recognition that had been there from the first morning he came back to her door. "Come and see him," she said. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby, and then at Mary and the baby, and thought about everything that led to this moment. The long road from Virginia, and the even longer road across the territory, and the particular Tuesday in October 1878, when he had ridden into Caldwell with a message he could not deliver, and a woman had opened her door and made him coffee and given him time to say what he had come to say. He had stayed much longer than it took him to find the words. He had stayed, it turned out, for the rest of his life. Outside, the Kansas spring was in full possession of the land, green and warm, and full of the particular promise that the prairie made and kept every year, the promise of space and sky and soil that would give back what you put into it. The cottonwoods along the creek were in young leaf, and the kitchen garden was already showing its first good growth, and the yellow curtains were bright in the morning window in Caldwell. Kansas was a town where a woman had made coffee for a stranger who could not find his words, and where that stranger had stayed and found something better than words, something that did not need to be said because it was lived. In every morning's coffee and every evening's lamp, and every ordinary extraordinary day of a life built from kindness and patience, and the specific grace of 2 people who had chosen each other honestly, and kept choosing each other in all the days that followed. Little Daniel James Garrison slept in his mother's arms with the peaceful certainty of someone who had arrived in the right place and knew it without knowing how he knew it. Andrew Garrison sat beside his wife and did not need to say anything at all. He had found his words a long time ago, and everything since then had been the living of them.